Welcome to the Steel Curtain Podcast. It's Monday, October 7th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are 3-2 after a 20-17 loss to the Dallas Cowboys in Week 5 of the 2024 NFL season. After an extended lightning delay at the stadium, formerly named for a bottle of ketchup, I'm Josh Yourish, and today I'm going to react to Dallas's dominance and Beanie Bishop's disappointing day, break down Mike Tomlin's abysmal game management again, and look ahead to some very tough decisions that Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan will have to make about the future of the franchise. But first, we've got to start with George Pickens because that is the big story coming out of last night's loss. It's very annoying when NFL coaches insult our intelligence. It's not just the media, right? It's everybody. And Mike Tomlin did that after the game, after George Pickens was essentially benched by the Steelers when Tomlin was talking to the media very, very late last night or very, very early this morning after the game. Mike Tomlin was asked about George Pickens having less snaps in the offense and what went into that. And he responded, quote, "We just wanted to kind of minimize his reps in an effort to get more productivity. We're just trying to manage in terms of the totality of the big picture," which is just Mike Tomlin nonsense. That's my words. Quote, "He wasn't less of a focal point in terms of our intentions of what we wanted to do offensively, but we did want to cut his reps a little bit in an effort to get a higher quality of play, just in general," end quote. And then he was asked to follow up. Was he not playing up to the quality that you wanted him? Which is an excellent follow-up question because he said, we want a higher quality of play. Well, apparently he's not playing to the quality that we need. Quote, "It's no different than we minimize some of the snaps of D linemen like Cam Hayward and so forth, man. It is just about snap management. It is no underlying story, to be quite honest with you." It seems like there is a story because Cam Hayward is a 35-year-old defensive tackle, and he played 55 snaps on the defensive side of the ball. George Pickens, a 23-year-old wide receiver, the only above average wide receiver on the Steelers roster, played 34 of 58 snaps on offense. And that comes on the heels of this week. Diana Rossini, the excellent reporter for The Athletic and George Mason alumni, as am I, named potential trade targets for the Chiefs at wide receiver after Rashee Rice's season-ending injury and included George Pickens as a player to watch. That kind of seemed to come out of left field considering Pickens is the Steelers' really only receiver on the roster, but okay. She's not just throwing that out there. This is information she's getting because she's a reporter, not just speculating. Clearly, she's hearing something about Pickens possibly being available, about Omar Khan potentially shopping Pickens, or maybe just about teams like Kansas City calling about Pickens. It may not be that they're actively shopping him, but they're fielding calls. And that's after he fumbled on the 5-yard line and dropped a touchdown in Indianapolis. On Sunday, Pickens played 34 of 58 total offensive snaps. Van Jefferson played 48. Calvin Austin played 44. Pickens still led the team with 6 targets, but only had 3 catches for 26 yards. Najee Harris actually led them in receiving with 2 catches for 35 yards. Yuck, that's disgusting. On a crucial 3rd and 4, up 10-6 in the third quarter, Fields looked Pickens' way. The left side of the field, near the sideline. It was a bit of a high throw, but it went right through the hands of Pickens. Clearly a drop, right? Not a perfect throw, catchable throw, especially when you're George Pickens. Pickens then later, after missing an extended stretch during his benching, if you will, Pickens essentially jogged across the field on a play action crossing route, which was designed to actually get a big play to go his way. Fields threw it his way, but Pickens never got separation because he wasn't going 100%. And the throw was too far because he wasn't going 100%. It was an awful effort, an obvious awful effort. And a lot of the Steelers film guys on Twitter who do an excellent job, like we had Derek Bell on last week, have been all over it this morning on Twitter, sharing that play because it's so obvious that Pickens is not giving his 100% effort. And clearly that's a reason why he seems to be in the doghouse. And then on the last play of the game, Pickens yanked Dallas cornerback Jordan Lewis to the ground by his face mask. That was after the final play ended. It was a really bad look to the end of a really bad game. Pickens could be facing some disciplinary action either from the team or from the league. For that one, George Pickens leads the team with 23 catches for 310 yards and no touchdowns. And the team has no wide receivers, right? It's Van Jefferson and Calvin Austin getting the snaps outside of George Pickens. We saw a guy they signed off the street get a crucial 2nd and 10 target, and he turned it into a 9-yard catch yesterday instead of Pickens because Pickens was on the bench. There's clearly some fracture in the relationship between Pickens and the team, right? I won't say it's a completely fractured relationship because I don't know. Maybe the reporters can let us into what that relationship is like on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis. But it's clear he's not giving the team the effort that they need, and he is unhappy with either the team, the quarterback, something. And Tomlin lied about it in the press conference because the reason he got less snaps was not to minimize the amount of workload, to maximize the production. That's garbage. That's not true at all. We saw what happened. We know the talent level on the roster. We know that if George Pickens, your team's best wide receiver, is on the bench, there is a much better reason. Because talent-wise, there's no reason for George Pickens to ever be on the bench. This is such a hard thing because there's one side arguing you have to have Pickens out there for 100% of the snaps. And there's another side arguing you have to hold him accountable for this lack of effort. And I'm kind of torn, right? Because George Pickens is your best offensive playmaker. But I'm done with this diva wide receiver nonsense that we've been going through since the Antonio Brown days. Justin Fields wasn't great on Sunday night, but if that's the effort you're getting from your number one wide receiver, how can you succeed as a quarterback, as an offense? Especially when you don't have a good number two, a viable number two, let alone a good number two. This comes months after the Steelers had to trade Deontay Johnson because he wasn't playing hard, refused to block, and also had a frayed relationship with the team and its coaching staff. Mike Tomlin constantly gets credit for managing personalities like Le'Veon Bell, like Antonio Brown, now like George Pickens, because he's a player's coach, right? He has that reputation. Guys want to play for him. That's what we always hear. But when it's a trend and it keeps happening, there are really two possibilities, right? The front office is overconfident in his ability to manage those mercurial talents, so they overload his roster with them. And eventually that reaches a breaking point with guys like Johnson, guys like Pickens. Or they need to stop. So maybe they need to stop drafting those types of players. Or Tomlin has created an environment where he enables these players to become the divas that we see year after year after year. And George Pickens' lack of effort shouldn't necessarily go back to the head coach, but it's something we've seen from multiple receivers and talented players over Mike Tomlin's tenure. Maybe he deserves credit for getting anything out of them. Maybe he deserves blame for allowing this to continue to happen. Either way, it has to end. Either way, we're done with this. Especially when the Steelers aren't competing for a Super Bowl. You are in a culture building phase. You want to keep guys like Cam Hayward around because of that. Because he's great in the locker room. Because he's a Walter Payton Man of the Year. Because he would never give less than 100% effort. Same with TJ Watt. Same with other guys we saw on the defense. Even a Landon Roberts who dove over the line of scrimmage on the last possession, Dallas's last possession of the game, and forced a fumble and nearly won the game. This has to end on the offensive side of the football, even if it makes you worse. Because the difference between the Steelers with and without George Pickens is not the difference between a Super Bowl contender and not. It's the difference between a team that sneaks in the playoffs and maybe a team that is just on the outside and is drafting a little bit higher. Either way, it's the same reality. It's still purgatory. So when you're building to something and you don't view Pickens as a long-term part of the future, you have to make a really difficult decision. And that's what we're going to get into later in the episode. We're going to get into these difficult decisions that the Steelers are going to have to make about the future of this franchise, about the direction of this franchise and where it goes, which sounds very extreme after a 3-0 start turns into a 3-2 start. And coming into the year, if you saw 3-2, it would look pretty good, but this is against a Dallas team that didn't have Micah Parsons, that didn't have DeMarcus Lawrence. The offense still looks inept with Arthur Smith calling the plays and with Justin Fields instead of Kenny Pickett. And that's not to absolve Matt Canada. That's not to absolve Kenny Pickett. They needed to go. They were not up to the quality that the Steelers needed, but it's not getting any better. So eventually you have to have a come to Jesus moment where you decide, where are we going as a franchise? And we'll get into what those specific decisions are going to be at the end of the episode. But first, we have to get into the defense's performance because we talked about George Pickens and the lack of effort in his play. On the defensive side of the ball, I'm not sure it's a lack of effort. It just might not be as good of a defense as we thought it was or wanted it to be, right? I talked about how it was on a historically good start after 3 games. And I also caveated that with they played Kirk Cousins coming off of an Achilles injury. You've heard me say this before. They played Bo Nix in his second NFL start when he clearly was not ready. And Bo Nix has looked better since then, but he looked atrocious against the Steelers, and understandably so. And then they faced after you get out of that 3-0 start, right, where you have Kirk Cousins off an Achilles and Bo Nix and an injured Justin Herbert on a sprained ankle turns into Taylor Heineke, and the Chargers don't gain any yards in the home opener. Then you face Joe Flacco and Dak Prescott with a very underwhelming offense that suffered injuries on the offensive line, just like the Steelers have, and a Dallas team with no talent left on defense with Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence out, and you lose, right? You lose these back-to-back games. So maybe you're not a very good team, and maybe you're not a very good defense. For the second straight week, it's an underwhelming offense that got the best of the Steelers defense. The Steelers have so many issues on offense. We've gotten into those. We've beaten them to death. But the defense, that's why the defense needs to carry this team. And it's not able to do that. And it's a $138 million defense. And it can't carry this team because it's not that good of a unit. It is very flawed. And 20 points, the 20 points that Dallas put up is not reflective of how poor the Steelers defense actually played. The Cowboys gained 445 total yards. That's the most an offense has gained against the Steelers since the Texans game last season when CJ Stroud lit them up. Dak Prescott threw for 352. Dallas hadn't had a run over 15 yards all season and had the worst run game in the NFL. And Rico Dowdle went for 87 yards on 20 carries. Jalen Tolbert, a mid-round pick out of South Alabama, I believe, torched the secondary with 7 grabs for 87 yards in the game-winning touchdown. The Cowboys went 1 for 4 in the red zone with 2 red zone turnovers, a Dak interception to Dante Jackson, which was just mind-boggling, and a TJ Watt strip sack, which was an incredible play by TJ Watt, who reached the 100-sack milestone for his career against Dallas, the one silver lining of that awful performance. And they nearly forced another on the final possession before Dallas finally scored that game-winning touchdown when Landon Roberts went flying over the line of scrimmage and forced that fumble, but they couldn't recover it. They also blocked a field goal by Isaiah Loudermilk. And they still lost. And they still gave up 20 points. The Steelers were outgained 445 to 226 and only lost by 3. Right? Like maybe that's a credit to their ability to make big plays and bend don't break, but turnovers are nice, but they're noisy. right? They're not consistent game to game. You're not going to get Dak throwing to Dante Jackson inexplicably because he likely miscommunicated with his wide receiver or something in the red zone and just hands it to you, right? These are not reliable ways to win football games. You have to stop the other team. And the Steelers were unable to do that all night. Dallas should have won by 2, maybe 3 scores. There are so many issues on this Steelers defense, and a lot of them start in the secondary, right? We talked last week when I had Derek Bell on from Steelers Now, and he and I both said, like, this Steelers defense is built to win up front with relentless pressure on the quarterback, and that will throw everything out of whack. Well, they got great pressure. TJ Watt and Nick Herbig were excellent. Each had 5 pressures. Cam Hayward was excellent again. He's been incredible this year. That defensive line is one of the best in the NFL, maybe the best in the NFL. And it doesn't matter because there are so many holes in this secondary. Minkah Fitzpatrick has been questionable, right? He's getting caught in the middle of the field, not getting to the sideline to help his cornerbacks. He's not covering as much ground as maybe he used to, but a lot of that's also, okay, he hasn't had an interception in a while. That's noisy, like I said, so I'm not going to ding Minkah for that too much. I still like the safety play. Deshaun Elliott was maybe their best defensive player outside of Watt and Herbig and Hayward, so outside of that defensive line, I thought Elliott was really good, but he ended up giving up a lot in coverage because he tripped against Rico Dowdle, who caught the 1 touchdown. And he allowed the Tolbert touchdown as well, but that was running through a lot of traffic and the pressure just didn't get home. I'm not going to ding Elliott for that because he's been good. He's been one of the true bright spots in the secondary, but there aren't many, right? Joey Porter Jr. got his first interception of the year. He was a lot better in coverage after getting torched by Indianapolis a week ago. He still doesn't want to tackle, right? The entire Steelers defense at one point in the game turned into Muhammad Ali trying to throw right hooks constantly, and Collinsworth wouldn't stop talking about it because it was a great point. Like, they tried to punch everything out, and that's good. But when you're for sure going to make the tackle, there were times Joey Porter Jr. didn't have any interest in tackling. He just wanted to swing and let his teammates take care of it. That's not how you play good NFL defense. You're not going to reliably punch the ball out enough to justify taking those swings when you don't have a short tackle, right? TJ Watt takes those swings. I trust TJ Watt to not miss tackles. Joey Porter Jr. has not proven that he's not going to miss tackles yet. Then, on the other side, Dante Jackson, not very good, continues to miss huge tackles on some of the biggest plays of the game. He did it last week against Indianapolis when he was one-on-one with Josh Downs on a crucial 3rd down and couldn't make the tackle. And it happened again last night against a Cowboys tight end when he went for the pass breakup instead of the tackle on a 3rd and 9 when you could force the Cowboys into a field goal and get the ball back in a tie game. Instead, he went for the breakup, which would have been irrelevant if he just brought the man down. The ball was caught, ran for a 1st down, and the rest is history. But that's a huge issue, aside from his interception, which was not a great play by him. It was just a horrible throw from Dak. And then we get to Beanie Bishop. The Steelers continue to try to do this at slot cornerback because they hit on Mike Hilton, right? Mike Hilton was an undrafted player. He turned into a star. He was great blitzing from the nickel spot. He caused havoc for opposing offenses. He was a great player for how they acquired him as an undrafted free agent, right? Great relative to the acquisition cost. He was a good player for their defense. And then they got Arthur Mollett, and that was not quite as good. And they've continued to try to roll the dice in this slot cornerback position with low-cost players, but we're not playing in the 90s anymore. We're not playing in the early 2000s anymore where you live in base defense and that's an extra player, right? The nickel is an extra player. That's your base. You're going to have 5 defensive backs on the field pretty consistently. So you better have a good one. That's a starting position in the NFL, and the Steelers do not value it that way for some reason. And now they're desperate to get Cam Sutton back from suspension. Sutton was so bad in Detroit last year after they signed him to a big extension, and obviously the off the field issues, that's why he's suspended, but that Detroit was willing to cut ties and release him. He was one of the worst corners in the NFL, and we're desperate to get him back from a suspension because Beanie Bishop is just not an NFL player. He played 57 snaps, 56 of them were in the slot. He's the number one nickel. Just doesn't belong on an NFL field. He had 2 massive penalties that really hurt the Steelers, allowed 6 catches for 90 yards. He was awful in coverage, and the Steelers were actually forced to call a timeout. I'll get into Mike Tomlin's clock management a little bit. Like, I'm not going to dive into that too much because I think there were so many other issues. But in the fourth quarter, you get the ball back and you have no timeouts when you're in a winnable situation, right? You have a chance to tie the game with a field goal, 20 seconds, but okay, that's doable if you have 3 timeouts. Instead, they wasted them. One, because Beanie Bishop was the extra man on the field and they were going to get a penalty for too many men. So Tomlin had to call a timeout. And another down at the goal line because after the Cowboys came out of a timeout on the final play of the game, before the final play, offensive play for Dallas, where they scored the touchdown, they came out lined up with CeeDee Lamb on the slot, trying to get Beanie Bishop matched up on him, and he was. And I have to assume that's a massive reason the Steelers called that timeout, which was a huge mistake. Because even if you give up that touchdown, which they ultimately did, even after calling the timeout, you at least have a chance to stop the clock. You can use the middle of the field. You can use that timeout to set up a field goal if you somehow get into field goal range. It changes everything about how you can operate offensively. Instead, you're in desperation mode. You get 2 plays and neither of them work, right? That clock management was a disaster from Tomlin. And a big reason is because he was trying to cover up for Beanie Bishop's mistakes. This defense is not what we thought it was. It's not one of the best defenses in the NFL. It's not good enough to carry an abysmal offense. And that's going to put the Steelers in a really tough situation going forward because they're going to have to make some tough decisions, especially with George Pickens not seeming interested, right? Like and the back half of the schedule. This is a really tough spot, a really precarious situation for the Steelers because the second half schedule is an absolute gauntlet, and now you're not making up the ground you need to make up before you get there. And a big reason is because of the defense. The offense is not really any better. Functionally, statistically, it has not been better than last year with Matt Canada and Kenny Pickett. I think Justin Fields is a massive upgrade over Kenny Pickett. I think Arthur Smith is an upgrade over Matt Canada. But there's injuries on the offensive line. Broderick Jones has been a turnstile. There are big problems. So the defense needs to carry you. Mike Tomlin coaches the game expecting his defense to carry him. Even on the very first offensive drive for the Steelers, you get into 2nd and 10, you run it with Jonathan Ward. This is near the red zone, like on the fringe of the red zone, right? It's a pretty successful drive. You missed a big shot to Connor Hayward, but you still have a chance. And you get to 3rd and 8, and you do a pitch from shotgun to Aaron Shamplin, gain a couple yards, have no chance at a first down, and you got to kick a field goal. Like, he's playing for field goals. He continues to do this. And in one sense, it's because his offense isn't very good. The offense, 2 things can kind of be true, right? The offense isn't good because Mike Tomlin and Arthur Smith, and the edict, I believe, comes from Mike Tomlin, have been incredibly conservative in their play calling. But they've been incredibly conservative in their play calling because the offense is not very good. So it kind of snowballs on itself. Like, it's not even a chicken or the egg thing. Like, both things are true. The offense would be better if they were more aggressive, but if the offense was better, they would be more aggressive. So you have a head coach playing to win low-scoring games, and his defense gave up 445 yards to an undermanned Cowboys team with CeeDee Lamb being held relatively in check and Dak Prescott turning over the ball 3 times along with a blocked field goal. That's not good enough for this Steelers team to have any success down the stretch or into the playoffs if they somehow would scratch and claw and get there. And on defense, like this, a lot of things went right. Not just those turnovers, but Watt and Herbig and Hayward dominating up front. That's how the defense is built to win. That's where all the money's spent. Even though Alex Highsmith's out, Herbig has been excellent. And once Herbig went down with a hamstring injury and DeMarvin Leal went out with the stinger, right, things got way worse. But they were already in a tough spot before that happened. They were already struggling to get stops before that happened. And they still had the impact up front that you want from this defense. They did dominate the Cowboys' offensive line, especially on passing plays. And Dak Prescott was able to carve up the secondary because it's not a good secondary. Because Beanie Bishop is not an NFL player. Because Dante Jackson has not tackled well. He's not very reliable in coverage. And because Minkah Fitzpatrick, maybe he's taken a half step back as a player. Maybe even a quarter step back. But that's significant when you're a middle of the field safety trying to patrol everything back there. The Steelers are trying to keep a lid on explosive plays with a single high safety, unlike the rest of the league that's going too high, because they believe Minkah Fitzpatrick is that good of a player. But we saw that that might not be the case. So there are a lot of issues that are just building on each other. And you get a loss like that where everything goes to Mike Tomlin's plan. If you win the turnover battle, if you're conservative, you play these low-scoring games, you should win. But you didn't because your defense isn't good enough. So then that calls into question the entire construction of this roster and the direction of this franchise. And that's what we have to get into with these big decisions that the Steelers are going to face. But before that, I have to tell you about Underdog Fantasy because it's the greatest time of the year. It may not sound that way to me because I'm very frustrated with my Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm still thrilled that football is back. We had college football that kept me up till 2:45 in the morning on Saturday with Miami and Cal and a crazy comeback and Cam Ward being amazing in the fourth quarter after some ridiculous turnovers. And last night we had the lightning delay and then a 1 o'clock finish for the Steelers and the Cowboys. And I love it. I'm tired, but I love it because football's back. It's here to stay till February, and it's the best time of the year. Over 1 million fans across 33 states got into the game last year by making picks on Underdog, and you can too. Underdog is a ton of fun, right? I said I love football. I love watching till all hours of the night, and it's even more fun when you're involved, when you have some rooting interest, so you can pick these higher or lower stats on Underdog Fantasy for your favorite player or your least favorite player, right? Maybe I'll take some lowers for some Najee Harris rushing yards because I don't think he's a very good running back, and this offensive line is a big problem. It's a lot of fun, so get into the fun with Underdog Fantasy. Making picks on Underdog is straightforward, and signing up is even easier. Just head over to Underdog's simple-to-use mobile app or underdogfantasy.com. Sign up with promo code STILLCURTAIN. That's STILLCURTAIN, and Underdog will give you a free pick to use on your first cash pick'em entry, plus up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you deposit. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code STILLCURTAIN to claim your new customer special of a free pick and your deposit offer. Must be 18 plus, 21 plus, Massachusetts and Arizona, 19 plus, Alabama and Nebraska, and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. Void in Colorado. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.ncpgambling.org. Arizona 1-800-NEXT-STEP, 1-800-369-8783, or text NEXT STEP to 53342. New York, call the 24/7 Hope line at 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. It's decision time now for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we have to start with the biggest one, the most obvious one, the one that was reported on the sidelines during Sunday Night Football. Justin Fields or Russell Wilson? It sounds like Russell Wilson is healthy enough to play, is going to be healthy enough to play next week. And it sounds like from that sideline report, Russell Wilson believes he's going to be the starter when he's healthy enough. I don't know if that's what he's been told by the coaching staff. That's what he just is believing in his own mind. But that's the way the sideline report sounded on Sunday Night Football, right? They mentioned that Russell Wilson has his new signature catchphrase for the Steelers, win the seventh. It's no longer let's ride with the Broncos. It's win the seventh. So we can look forward to hearing that if Russell Wilson is indeed named the starter. Justin Fields was far from excellent on Sunday Night Football. He finished 15 for 27 for 131 with 2 touchdown throws. And it could have been a lot better, right? If Connor Hayward had hung on to that deep shot in the first quarter, if Van Jefferson had held on to a back shoulder throw, if Fields had led Van Jefferson a little further on one that nearly was picked off and probably should have been picked off early in the game. There were some shot plays that were available that were taken by Fields and not connected on. But it still wasn't a great performance. This offense has not really been any better than the Matt Canada, Kenny Pickett offense. So that leads a lot of people to say, well, we have a guy that won a Super Bowl sitting on the sidelines. Why don't we put him in? And I'm sure that's what Russell Wilson is thinking too. Because Russell Wilson, in that report, it said that Wilson feels he'll be healthy enough to play next week. And when you're talking about a signature catchphrase, it sounds like you believe you're going to be the starting quarterback. Everything about that report sounded like it's going to be Wilson. And maybe it is, right? Mike Tomlin has refused to commit to Justin Fields as a starting quarterback, even after the 3-0 start. And maybe he felt that the team was a little fraudulent. Like maybe he felt that 3-2 was a very real possibility after 3-0. And maybe that's why he wanted to leave the door open. And I'm fine with that, right? I don't believe that either of these guys are your for sure long-term answer at the position. So I'm not fully committed to my position that Justin Fields is better. I believe he is better. I believe he should continue to play. I believe there's still more development to be had with him, and we've seen some good signs. But if they're willing to open up the offense a little bit more with Russell Wilson, I've said that before, okay, let's see what that looks like. I'm not going to be thrilled about it. I think his catchphrases are corny. I think Russell Wilson is very interested in the success of Russell Wilson and not many others. But if the success of Russell Wilson helps the Pittsburgh Steelers win some more football games, then let's see what it looks like. But I would much rather, if it was my decision, right? I'll tell you what the decision I would make with each of these decisions we're going to face. And then I'll tell you what I think they're going to do. If it's my decision, I first would have never signed Russell Wilson, but I certainly wouldn't play him after this start we've seen from Justin Fields. Even if Justin Fields' start was worse, I still wouldn't have much interest in playing Russell Wilson because he's a 35-year-old quarterback. We need a long-term answer. So my decision would be you stick with Justin Fields. You ride out the highs and the lows. You see if you have something here. Even if you're going to rebuild some other things in the offense, move a piece like George Pickens, that's entirely possible. And in that case, I want Justin Fields on the field even more because he has the ability to run the football. And we saw that in the offense on Sunday night. They got him involved in more of these quarterback leads with Najee Harris leading the way and these sweep plays with Justin Fields. And that was well designed. It gained some good yardage. He's a physical runner. You want to get him downhill, right? He's not Lamar Jackson. He's not going to make people miss. You want to get him downhill. They did a pretty good job of doing that, even if they're running at the edges of the Dallas defense. And that's a good idea because DeMarcus Lawrence and Michael Parsons were not there. So from that standpoint, it was a pretty sound plan. They didn't break any big ones, but that'll be an even more important part of the offense if they do move on from George Pickens, or if George Pickens is in the doghouse even longer for this offense, and that seems like a real possibility. So I would stick with Justin Fields. I think they are. I think it's like 60-40, if I'm being honest, but the 60% being starting Russell Wilson next week. Given that he is healthy enough, given that we're taking the right things away from that Sunday Night Football report, that he is actually healthy, I would say I would bet that it's Russell Wilson. I don't feel super confident about that because Mike Tomlin has given us nothing to feel confident in when talking about the quarterback position. He's gone back and forth. But I think it'll probably be Russell Wilson next week in Las Vegas as the Steelers are 3.5 point favorites against the Raiders. And that would feel like maybe a decent little spot to bet on the Las Vegas Raiders, even coming off of a blowout loss to Denver, because I don't know that things are going to get much better with Wilson on the field if that is ultimately what happens. Long term, if you go to Russell Wilson now, you can still go back to Justin Fields. That is the nice thing about Russell Wilson coming into this situation with pole position, right? He's the veteran. He's won a Super Bowl. You can just defer to that and say, this is our guy. This is what we thought he was going to be. And if he plays poorly, you can go back to Justin Fields. That is the good thing about how Mike Tomlin has kind of managed this. But I still think it should be Justin Fields next week. And I don't think it will. The next decision that the Steelers have to make, it's a George Pickens decision. What do you do with this guy? He's your best wide receiver. He's clearly your most talented wide receiver, right? There's the discrepancy between like best, greatest, most talented, whatever. And Pickens is always like more talented than he is productive, or more talented than he is a great wide receiver. The semantics don't matter. He's all of them for the Steelers because they have nobody else. Van Jefferson is not a wide receiver 2. He's probably like a functional wide receiver 3 or 4, and he's thrust into a wide receiver 2 role. And in that way, I like feel for him because he shouldn't be getting the amount of snaps or responsibility or targets that he's getting in this offense. And it's out of necessity, especially once Cordero Patterson went down with an injury and you're losing Jalen Warren, so you can't split those guys out, right? You have some playmakers on this offense when it's healthy, but those playmakers are all gone. So you end up in a situation where Van Jefferson is a really important part of the offense, and he's just not good enough to do that. So it's hard to say you should move on from George Pickens. But it's also really hard to justify keeping him around if you can get something for him. Talent-wise, he's probably worth a first-round pick. Heading into the back half of the third year of his 4-year rookie contract, and he'll be wanting an extension this offseason. And with his lack of effort and his mercurial behavior and frankly immaturity, the Steelers would be lucky to get like a 4th or a 5th, I would imagine. And if you can get a 4th or a 5th, maybe a 3rd, maybe a 3rd. If somebody offers you a 3rd for George Pickens right now, you pull the trigger. If somebody offers you a 4th, you have a long conversation about it and you maybe move on. Because I don't see a world in which this gets a lot better. Mike Tomlin is good at managing, or at least has a good track record of managing these mercurial behaviors. He kept Antonio Brown in check for a long time. And I don't like to relitigate that because there's a lot of factors into why Antonio Brown became the guy that he did late in his career. Mike Tomlin did a fairly good job managing the Le'Veon Bell situation until the holdout. And even once the holdout happened. But there's always a breaking point. And it's never come back around. Right? We've never seen it reach the breaking point and then Tomlin be able to bring it back around and salvage the situation. He's been able to hold it together longer than maybe he should. And maybe with George Pickens, 2+ years is longer than anyone could. Because at Georgia, Kirby Smart there, he was a problem the entire time. He also had some injury issues, but he was a problem at Georgia. He was immature at Georgia. He was suspended multiple times by the team. That's why he fell into the second round. That's why the Steelers were able to get him, which is good drafting. But eventually there comes a breaking point. Maybe we've reached it. I have a hard time believing they will move on from George Pickens in the middle of the season. But I definitely think that they should. I think they should the way they did with Chase Claypool. Luckily for them, they were able to keep the wool pulled over everyone in the NFL's eyes longer with Chase Claypool and get a second-round pick out of it and ultimately Joey Porter Jr. I don't think that's the case with George Pickens. I think people see the talent. I think people also see the lack of effort. I think it's too blatantly obvious and he's too high profile of a player. So I think it's maybe a mid-round pick at best. And even with the scrap heap of wide receivers you have left in the organization at such a point that you move on from George Pickens, I still think you have to do it. Because this team isn't going to a Super Bowl either way. So let's salvage the culture. Let's get something for the future. Let's be forward thinking about this. Because eventually you need a path out of purgatory. And I don't see what that is. I think the Steelers will make a decision with George Pickens. Because the ultimate question here is like, do you make a decision or not? Do you bench him? Do you trade him? Do you just run him back out there? I think bench or trade are the options, are the more likely outcomes of this situation than just trotting him back out there. But it's possible. I would move on from Pickens and salvage what you can in terms of a draft pick, in terms of maybe a player coming back. Maybe a lower talented wide receiver who's going to play a whole lot harder. And then you see what you got with Roman Wilson. You see what you have with Van Jefferson. We know what we have there. You see what you have with Calvin Austin a little bit more. You just try to throw this together for this season because this season doesn't have a Super Bowl ceiling regardless. And then that brings to the final decision that the Steelers have to make. And it's about a specific player. But it's also about like the idea and the direction of the franchise altogether, which is not where I thought we'd be after 5 weeks. But it's where I am. It's where my mind is going. Because this is not just 5 weeks this season. It is seasons and seasons of the same. Of being in NFL purgatory. And you need a path out. You really have two options. You go all the way in. Or you blow it up. Going all the way in would be trading for Davante Adams. I advocated against the Steelers trading for Brandon Ayuk because I didn't think that made them a Super Bowl contender. I don't think a Davante Adams trade will make them a Super Bowl contender either. So I don't really think that's the route that they should go. And I don't think it is the route that they will go. Because they don't have an answer at quarterback. But you need something at wide receiver. And Adams is an option. He's on the trade market. They're heading to Las Vegas. Maybe he could just switch locker rooms next week if Omar Khan ups the ante with an offer. And maybe you can take what you got in a George Pickens deal and swing it over to Vegas with a little bit extra, or maybe a lot extra, to get Davante Adams, who's in his 30s and on an expensive contract, but is a reliable wide receiver who you could construct a passing game around. You can't do that with George Pickens You could construct a passing game around Davante Adams. He's versatile enough. He's a big playmaker enough, even at his advanced age. But I don't think they will. And I'm not so sure that they should, because you still don't know you have an answer at quarterback. I'm all for pushing the chips to the center of the table when you feel good about what you have at quarterback. That's what the Rams did, right? They got Matthew Stafford. They traded Jared Goff for Matthew Stafford because they said, we need a Super Bowl caliber quarterback. Once we have him, we can go all in. And they did. And they won a Super Bowl. That's rare that happens. It's really rare that happens. And the only way you can justify doing it is if you feel really good about who you have at quarterback. Because look at the Miami Dolphins. They did it too. They pushed all the chips to the center of the table. They traded for Tyreek Hill. They took on big offensive contracts. They kept drafting offensive skill players to maximize Tua Tagovailoa. And Tua's hurt. And that's a big reason that the bottom has fallen out. But it's not the only reason. They lost Christian Wilkins in free agency this offseason. And the offense was struggling even with Tua last year in the playoffs. They couldn't do anything against Kansas City because the offense that Mike McDaniel built is so Tua specific. And if you need to build such a hyper-specific offense for your quarterback to succeed, then you don't have the right quarterback. Miami did not have the right quarterback. And now Tua's career might be over, and it's an awful situation. And I will not feel good about seeing him on an NFL field again after another concussion. But aside from that, it was a flawed roster construction because you didn't have the centerpiece to hold everything together. You did not have the quarterback gravitational pull to hold everything together when you went all in, like the Rams did with Matthew Stafford. So the bottom fell out. And you lost the quarterback, and the bottom really fell out. But it was falling out before Tua got hurt again. And then you look at the other teams that are competitors. It's San Francisco, maybe not San Francisco after they lost to Arizona, but still San Francisco. They were in the Super Bowl last year. It's Detroit in the NFC. These are some of the top contenders. It's Buffalo in the AFC. It's Kansas City in the AFC. And it's Baltimore. Baltimore's a unique case. The Steelers are trying to do what Kansas City and Baltimore did. Continue to be good and strike gold with a quarterback and go from good to great. You have to have the aggressiveness in acquiring a quarterback, and then you become even more aggressive once you have him. The Steelers aren't ready to do that. So it's a really tough thing to do. But you look at a Buffalo, a Detroit, even a San Francisco. These are teams that bottomed out to get the pieces that have carried them into contention. Buffalo, we think of them now as like Josh Allen is going to carry them to 10, 11 wins every year. And they got him not with the number 1 pick, but with the number 7 pick, and they've developed him really well, and they traded for Stephon Diggs. But that is a team that really bottomed out. Before they had Josh Allen, they took on the most dead money then in NFL history, gutting their roster to try to build it back up. And it worked. Detroit did the same thing. They gutted everything to the studs. And I'm not even sure they can win a Super Bowl because I'm not so sure they have the exact right quarterback. But they're in contention. They played in an NFC championship game. The Steelers haven't won a playoff game since 2016. The 49ers I mentioned, they bottomed out. That's how they got Nick Bosa. And the Steelers have TJ Watt. They didn't need to bottom out to get him. But the 49ers got all this high-end talent. And then they believed in Brock Purdy, and then they traded for Christian McCaffrey. And they signed Brandon Ayuk to another big contract. And they signed Javon Hargrave in the offseason. You have to have a quarterback you believe in to push all the chips in. I don't think the Steelers do, so I think it would be wrong to do that. And even Detroit and San Francisco, maybe they don't have the perfect quarterback, but they have enough of a talent nucleus that they could push more chips into the center of the table. And Detroit even needs to do more. Like, I think they could afford a trade for a big-time pass rusher. And maybe they call the Steelers about that. Steelers have some big-time pass rushers that maybe they should consider moving. I'm not calling to blow it up after a 3-2 start. I just want a path out of purgatory. And I don't think a Davante Adams trade provides it. I'd be open to a trade for a veteran, established wide receiver, maybe an Amari Cooper if he desperately wants out of Cleveland, and why wouldn't you? And you could get him for a 4th or a 5th because he's near the end of his contract and not as productive as Davante Adams. I'm very open to something like that. But pushing the chips to the center of the table, I don't think now's the time. But I also think, right, because I'm continually trying to square these different realities. If they did it, I'd say at least we have a plan. At least we have a path now. At least we have a direction. We're going for it. Okay, I can get behind that. Continue to go for it. If you trade away George Pickens, maybe trade away some of the defensive talent. I'm not saying TJ Watt, but Alex Highsmith gets healthy. Maybe you look into moving him. Some of these ancillary pieces. And you're saying, okay, we're looking to the future. That's a path. I'm into that. It feels like we're stuck in the middle again. Maybe the answer is just getting a quarterback. But man, it feels really bad right now. And it doesn't look like it's going to get a whole heck of a lot better because the schedule gets harder. Next week, Las Vegas, that's a winnable game. Then New York comes to town, Sunday Night Football again. That's a winnable game. That's the New York Jets. Then the Giants on Monday Night Football in Pittsburgh in Week 8. 3 winnable games in a row. You better win them because Washington is now not a winnable game. Baltimore is obviously not. Cleveland's terrible, but Cincinnati has a great offense. Philadelphia, not a Super Bowl contender anymore, but a good team. Baltimore again, Kansas City, Cincinnati again. It is a gauntlet in the back half. So before the trade deadline, make some decisions. Is it about this year? Is it about the future? It's time to decide. I think it should be about the future, but I'll take it being about this year because it's got to be about something. Because riding this out, winning 9 games again, and having no answers at the important positions on this offense and on this defense, frankly, because the defense is a big problem, just isn't going to cut it. It's felt really bad for the Steelers for a while now. Let's figure out a way out of it. Maybe that starts with a win next week against the Las Vegas Raiders, and I'll be back to recap that next Monday. If that is a win, if that is a loss, if the sky is falling, if George Pickens is traded, we'll have you covered on the Still Curtain podcast. As always, like and subscribe to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts, and especially on YouTube. We really appreciate that support. I'll be live next Monday at 1:30. And until then, have a good week and go Steelers.